Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today we're going to be talking about the words polytheism and monotheism. Well, actually, my friend Eve Keneinan will be doing most of the talking, as she researched the rather interesting history of these words and wrote it up in a blog post which I'm going to read, interspersed with a little commentary. I will, of course, link her blog post in the description. And as a practical note, in her post, Eve refers to herself by the first-person singular pronoun, and I'm going to read that as is. I'll use pictures on screen to indicate who is talking, and try to mention when I'm breaking in. So, without further ado, monotheism versus polytheism. I have long been under the impression that monotheism and polytheism are two of the most unfortunate words in English, or in any language. The two words present one who hears them with a near intellectual necessity to think the concepts are speaking about the same sort of thing, in exactly the same way, as monosyllabic means a word of only one syllable, and polysyllabic means a word of more than one syllable. Polytheism does mean many gods. However, monotheism does not mean only one god, but rather God rather than the gods. The two terms seem to be saying something parallel, on the same level, but they are not. This generates endless confusion, because monotheists are nothing at all like polytheists. In fact, it may be the case that polytheists are also monotheists, in at least one sense of the term. I was trying to track down the source of these execrable terms. I'd assumed some idiot scholar somewhere was responsible, and I was eager to add his name to my list of people who will get a well-deserved beating if I ever get my hands on a time machine. But the truth turns out to be much more complicated and interesting, as truth often does. And the idea that they are parallel terms, on par with one another, seems to have been a kind of accident of language, as much as anything else, although there is some scholarly blame, as we'll see. Apparently, polytheist was originally the coinage of the philosopher Philo of Alexandria. Hey, breaking in for a second to give context, Philo of Alexandria was born in 25 BC and died in AD 50. Alexandria was a city in the Roman province of Egypt on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and as you can guess from it being named after Alexander the Great, had not inconsiderable Greek influence. Back to Eve. Now, Philo was both a Jew and a Platonist and would never be so stupid as to fall into the confusion above. Just the opposite, in fact. In coining the term polytheist, he was attempting to underscore to his Greek audience the manifest absurdity of the idea of putting together many and gods. He also needed a more polite and non-Jewish word for Gentiles. Philo was a learned Jew of Alexandria who was in the middle camp of Jews. In those days, in Alexandria especially, the Jewish community was roughly divided into three camps, of roughly equal size. Some Jews were Jewish purists, who wanted to wrap themselves up in Jewish tradition and keep out encroaching Hellenism at all costs. Some Jews, like everyone else, saw the glory and greatness of Greek civilization and wanted to Hellenize. Philo was an advocate of the middle way between the Jewish separatists and the Hellenizers. While he recognized the greatness of Hellenic culture and thought, he held that the Jews ought not to be considered inferior, comparable to the many other barbaric and unsophisticated cultures that the Greeks had simply swamped and absorbed. "For what is Plato but Moses speaking Attic Greek?" said Aristobulus of Pallenius, one of the 70. Nothing could make the Jews stop being Jews, not even the Greeks, and that's saying something. And for all the glory and greatness and excellence of the Greeks, it was clear that there was some one essential thing that the Greeks were lacking, and this was precisely what the Jews had, namely, a proper knowledge of the nature of God. Philosophically speaking, the Greeks could arrive at a correct conception of God. Socrates was already aware that the gods were not the God, to whom Socrates frequently referred. Indeed, it was Socrates' rather evident disdain for the gods that made the charge of atheism leveled against him plausible. Plato arrived at the he idea tu agathu, or the idea of the good, which, as Socrates says in the Politeia, the Republic, is still beyond being, exceeding it in dignity and power. Aristotle arrived at the idea of the prime mover, or absolutely first mover of all things, which is an unmoved mover. And certainly no one can doubt the mythological and poetical richness of Greek mythology and tradition. Aesthetically, the gods of Olympus are as remarkable as anything else the Greeks set their minds and hands to. But between the splendid gods of the Greeks and Plato's the good or the one, there lies a gulf. It was precisely this gulf or gap that the early Jewish Hellenic philosophers such as Aristobulus and Philo were convinced that the Jews could fill. The Greeks needed the Jewish understanding of the one God, of the God who is the good, the God who is not a magnificent being among beings, but is I am. For the Greeks, the idea of a personal being was practically a contradiction to the idea of the one or the good. The particularity involved in being an I seemed to them to exclude the universality of being. The Jews, Philo argued, were the people who had learned how to see God precisely as the eternal I am. So Philo coined the term polytheism as a kind of barbed term. An intelligent, educated Greek could hear the dissonance in the word. There is something wrong about it, something unstable, deliberately so. The poly is at odds with the theos. If the nature of divinity is to be ultimate or highest or first, how could there be many such? Deep down, the Greeks all knew well enough what really mattered was the God, as Socrates would have said, and not the various gods of the myths and stories. The idea of divine unity was one of the central, and hidden, teachings of many of the Greek mystery cults. Hi, I'm breaking in again. I thought an example or two of inherently contradictory words in English might be helpful. So consider if someone coined a word true-false to describe a contradiction, or describe parts of reality someone ignored because it was inconvenient as optional reality. Or if the result of school games in which everyone is a winner was described as everyone coming in multi-first place. The clash of the words tells you that there's something wrong with the things being described. But alas, the glory and the shame of the human race is that we can get used to anything, so of course such words can stop sounding like contradictions through repetition. Back to Eve. So by calling the Greeks polytheists, Philo was attempting to jar them into philosophical questioning, to awaken questions which, he intended to show, the Jews had answers that the Greeks did not. It wasn't an easy task to convince the Greeks that another people had insights they did not, but it was not impossible either. The Greeks were never averse to borrowing any idea from any other people they encountered, and everyone, even the Greeks, recognized that the Jews were somehow a unique and singular people. Philo met with at least partial success and can be perhaps credited with laying some of the ground upon which Christianity would take root and grow a couple centuries later. But we are chasing words, so let us leave fair Alexandria, a city made half of philosophy and half of riots. Polytheism appears to have lain dormant as a term until the French philosophe Jean Bodin resurrected it in 1580, taking it over directly from Philo. It reappeared in an era newly obsessed with the idea of classification. Monotheism seems to be an English coinage, from various theological debates that centered around a group called the Cambridge Platonists, which included, among others, Ralph Cudworth and Henry More. The OED attributes the first use in print of monotheist to More's 1660 An Explanation of the Grand Mystery of Godliness, but there seems to be some evidence that Cudworth used it first. Cudworth is known to be the first to use theism in print, which he also coined, and it is likely that the terms came about in discussion between Cudworth and More, who were like-minded and close friends. Monotheism in the original usage of Cudworth and More seems to be equivalent to pantheism, the mono being taken as the idea that there is just one thing, and that thing, everything that is God. Cudworth and More were both Cambridge Platonists, but were also thoroughly men of their time, that is to say, of the early Enlightenment. They were part of what scholar Nathan MacDonald has rightly spoken of as an explosion of isms at that period in Western intellectual history. MacDonald cites N. Lash on the point. It is, I think, almost impossible to overestimate the importance of the massive shift in language and imagination that took place in Europe in the 17th century. A shift for which Desserteau has two striking phrases, the dethroning of the verb and the spatialization of knowledge. Suffice it to say that a massive shift in understanding was occurring, one in which European thinkers discovered a vast new love of categorization and classificatory schemata, and Cudworth and More became the dominant theological voices that shaped the discourse in English. Simply consider this: how many people, today, would think it unusual to use the term monotheism? And yet, the term dates from 1660 and has neither a clear nor direct connection with, for example, Christianity. In fact, when one considers it, the number of deities involved seems to be an obviously terrible and completely misleading way of dividing the world's various religions. What has a mere quantity got to do with anything substantial? So Cudworth and or More coined the term monotheism, as well as theism, by Cudworth in the mid-17th century, but as everyone should be aware, those who coin a term do not necessarily always get to be the ones who determine its meaning. From the days of More and Cudworth, The term monotheism has had a long and tortuous history, undergoing at least 3 major scholarly reconceptualizations, plus innumerable idiosyncratic uses of the term by individual scholars, either in connection with this tradition or not. The most complete account I've been able to find of the history of the word monotheism is Nathan MacDonald's Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, to which I refer any reader interested in a truly elaborate account of the term across the 3.5 centuries it has been in use, in all its twists and turns. Despite the fact that scholarly use has always been rather nuanced, although not consistent, when the words monotheism and polytheism passed into popular usage, it was probably inevitable that they would be put together as parallel terms by those unfamiliar with the historical, scholarly uses of them. Rather, the forms of the words, just by themselves, suggest exactly the same sort of parallelism which is implied by the pairs such as monosyllabic and polysyllabic, or monogamy and polygamy. The points to emphasize are 1. These terms are not from within any given faith or religious tradition. No polytheists even call themselves polytheists. Indeed, for polytheisms, there could hardly be a more irrelevant question than the number of the gods. Nor did those who were categorized by Enlightenment scholars as monotheists ever think of themselves under such a heading. It was indeed absolutely crucial for the Hebrews that Yahweh was absolutely one and absolutely other than the various gods of the various other peoples. But of course the oneness and uniqueness of Yahweh has nothing to do with mere enumeration, as if one were to count the gods of the Hebrews and arrive at the answer 1. So it eventually happened, and this was probably inevitable, that polytheism came to mean, in the popular mind, belief in many gods, and monotheism, belief in only one god. This is not what the term monotheism was ever meant to express, but no matter. The form of the words was enough to make the case in most people's minds. This is conceptually ruinous in several ways. 1. The alienness of the words to the faiths and traditions they attempt to classify causes systematic misunderstanding of those faiths and traditions. 2. The false appearance that the words were mutually exclusive, when they are not. 3. And worst of all, the tendency strongly engendered by these rather impoverished concepts to conflate God with the gods, the one God, who is the absolute source of all things, with the various powers and principalities which populate the spiritual world. This conflation would not be unlike confusing the Platonic form of dog for a dog, except it is much worse, since there is less distance between a dog and the intelligible form of dog. Both are creatures, particular dogs participate in the form of dog, etc., than between God and the gods. God has no more to do with the gods than he does with rocks, planets, electrons, or assault rifles. The only creatures of which we are aware that have any connection to God not shared by all other creatures are human beings, and this because we are created by God in the image of God, or at least so the Christian teaching has it. Vedantic Hinduism is a good case in point of the near-complete uselessness of the terms polytheism and monotheism. Hindus believe in literally millions of gods, so they are obviously polytheists. And yet, at the same time, all the millions of gods are created by Brahma. They are merely the dreams of Brahma, as are men and the world, and will vanish when Brahma wakes. And yet we're still not done, because Brahma is much more like Plato's demiurge, who creates the cosmos by giving recalcitrant matter form, than Brahma is like the god of the Jews or the Christians. Still beyond Brahma is Brahman, which is the absolute and ultimate beginning and end of all things, including Brahma, creator and sustainer of all lesser things. Very clearly it is Brahman, not Brahma, and certainly not any of the millions of other Hindu gods, that Jews and Christians would recognize as God, albeit God imperfectly understood due to the lack of direct divine revelation. Brahma in his relation to Brahman seems a little parallel to the heresy of Arianism, which held Christ to be the first and highest creature of God the Father, something the Church emphatically rejected. Let St. Nicholas breaking Arius' nose at the Council of Nicaea stand for the whole of the Orthodox Christian tradition on this point. Yes, Santa Claus punched out the arch-heretic. It only makes me think better of him. And much could be said about Plato's idea of the good. This is what Jews and Christians would recognize as God, and not the demiurge spoken of in the Timaeus, or the nous spoken of in the Philebus. To bring this to a close, my judgment is that the terms polytheism and monotheism are essentially useless. As concepts, they do not clarify the things they name, but in fact positively mislead and distort them. I suggest that you cease using them. They do no good, and considerable harm. By far the greatest harm the terms do is to make it too easy to confuse God with the gods, something which, as I've noted, is the most basic distinction one needs to be able to make in order to talk meaningfully about God. See my posts God versus the Gods, Which God Exists, God, Gods, and Kamikazes, as well as my reblog of the maverick philosopher, Bill Valacella's Some of Us Just Go One God Further, in which he takes apart the banal atheist trope about theists being atheists about other gods. That's the end of Eve's blog post, so I'll just give some closing thoughts. The first is that the modern confusion of monotheism and polytheism to be only numerically different results in some very odd misunderstandings of history. Like, for example, the people who talk about how Yahweh was a Canaanite storm god who won. Won what? Pagan gods are not in competition with each other for supremacy. Poseidon has no interest in people praying to him for a good harvest, Demeter has no interest in people praying to her for success in war, and Ares has no interest in people praying to him for calm waters at sea. The Greek pantheon complemented each other, they were not a collection of warring universalities. It gets even worse in fantasy novels and role-playing games which require warring deities, often to line up with an alignment system. I know Dragonlance best, so to use it as an example, there are three primary gods of, respectively, good, neutral, and evil. They are Paladine, Gillian, and Tachesis. But Gillian we never hear from. He's so neutral that he doesn't do anything, making him astonishingly pointless. And Paladine acts more like a king of the gods, obsessed with balancing out good and evil so that neither gets the upper hand. And right there you see the problem, where the writers know that you can't have a shared reality between conflicting universalities, and so they must actually be limited, and there must be something truly universal above them. Perhaps behind them would be a better metaphor? Anyway, it is the goddess of healing, Mishakal, who is the real god of good in the Dragonlance universe, in the sense that she is the only god primarily concerned with promoting life and happiness. Against her blind desire to create, there is something which permits Tachesis to destroy, but never to destroy all, which is really where we see a universal creator god behind all of the limited particulars. But mistaking God for the gods gets even worse in this sort of thing. Because the uncreated creator of all that is can heal people, every one of the gods in these systems can heal, despite that making no sense. Why on earth can the goddess of evil heal someone? And still less coherent is that each of the gods in the system created some race. Paladine created the elves, Gillian the humans, and Tachesis the orcs. But that makes Tachesis the goddess of evil only with regard to things she didn't create. So far as we know, the orcs who worship Tachesis are happy in their orcish way. It's slimier and stinkier than the elvish way of being happy. But then, if you've ever seen dogs eating poop and rolling around in the carcass of a rotting animal to perfume themselves, you'll know that not everyone finds happiness in the same things. Tachesis rules a domain called the Abyss, which is described as an awful place, but this is described from a human perspective, which makes sense since they were created for whatever realm Gillian rules over, not for the one Tachesis does. But again, it only stands to reason that the orcs, who were created to live forever in the Abyss, are happy there, since it's what they were made for. It is, in theory, natural to them. And this is where such things usually fall apart, because of course in the real story the Abyss is a place of universal suffering. That is, it's hell. While Paladine's realm, which should in theory be a place of happiness only for elves, not for humans, is heaven, because at the end of the day the familiar wins out. If you had three creator gods, in the sense of gods who can create ex nihilo, from nothing, that is, create being where there was no being before, their creatures would never interact. Each would make their realm, dependent only on themselves, and since there was no interdependence, there would be no interaction. Further, since each would be a creator with no dependence on their ex nihilo creation, each would be a god of pure good within their created realm. Instead, what we have is a sort of shadowy pantomime of that. Paladine, Gillian, and Tachesis are not creator gods, but craftsman gods. They're each dependent on a shared reality, and so the things they make are taken from that shared reality, and consequently also dependent on that shared reality. They're like the makers of BattleBots, only better at what they do. But as I said, the familiar usually wins out, and the authors of Dragonlance, who are most familiar with the idea of God, the uncreated creator, take properties proper only to him and give them to all the gods, resulting in an incoherent mess. And as it went in Dragonlance, it has gone in many other fantasy stories and games. I do not know how influential this sort of sloppiness has been, but if it was not influential, it is an excellent example of just how confused the confusion is. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.